oil and a fat is the same thing. They're combinations of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fats. And the term fat and oil is determined by how it looks at room temperature. So butter at room temperature is a solid. Canola oil at room temperature is a liquid. And it's really a combination. It's really determined by how much saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat there is in there. So if you get a fat and it's saturated, it means it has no double bonds in it. And it's quite solid. And so it will stay solid at room temperature. But at body temperature, which is what our 37 degrees, that will in fact be liquid. It'll be fluid. It's mobile. And you've only got to put butter out in the sun and you'll see it all melt. It just goes cool. If you put butter in the fridge, it goes rock solid. If you put one double bond into it, that becomes monounsaturated. It's got one double bond, and that creates a little bit of flexibility. If you put multiple double bonds into it, it becomes polyunsaturated. So multiple double bonds creates more flexibility, that's why polyunsaturated oil is liquid at room temperature. Now, saturated fats tend to be mostly coming from animal-based. Polyunsaturated fats tend to be coming from plants. Plants need to have all that flexibility and a liquid oil at cold temperatures because where you are, you get snow, I presume, at some point.
Yeah.
So if the plant had saturated fats in it, then the plant will die. It will just freeze up completely. So it needs liquidity. It needs liquidity at very low temperatures. So that comes from being polyunsaturated. Now, there's no food that is 100% saturated fat or 100% polyunsaturated. They've all got little combinations of it. Even butter's got a bit of polyunsaturated oil in it. So the poly then becomes you've got omega-3s, omega-6s, omega-9s, omega-12s. It goes on. And that refers to the number of double bonds that are in that chain of fatty acids to make up the oil. Now, the flexibility of that oil, the flexibility of that fatty chain comes at a price because each one of those double bonds becomes a point of weakness which can become oxidized. And the analogy is like a bit of metal that can rust. So when the seed oil becomes oxidized, that becomes rancid. So butter doesn't tend to go rancid because it doesn't have much in the way of double bonds in it. A seed oil, under the effect of oxygen, will become rancid. Now we've seen all this stuff that happens in our refrigerator if you leave the stuff on the bench. It goes, exactly the same process happens when we eat it. So the amount of fats and the distribution of fat, whether or not it's saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, that's in our body is a direct reflection of what we eat. So as I say, 100 years ago, it was estimated that the amount of omega-6, 6 double bonds in our body, was about 1%. And it's now been measured to be 25 to 30% in a linear way. And Stefan Guillenet put that stuff together 10 years ago now. Found a whole lot of articles starting in the 1950s where they started measuring the amount of linoleic acid in the fat. And again, that's an association evidence, but it makes sense. And what was interesting from other data, the amount of linoleic acid in breast milk of US women, United States women, was much, much, much higher than that in African women. So my take on all of that, and again, that in itself may be a little bit controversial, is that if we're actually making our babies at an embryonic level, 2 cells, 4 cells, 8, 16, and then going up from there, and we're starting with our building blocks being made up of oxidizable or oxidized fat, 30% of them, then we're creating our babies out of inflammatory material. Because remember the old story of the three little pigs? You know, if you've got a choice of building your house out of bricks or out of wood or out of twigs, that's what we're now making our babies for the last 50 years out of inflammatory polyunsaturated fats, which can become oxidized. We're combining it with high sugar and carbohydrate loads, and that creates inflammation, by my reckoning, in every single blood vessel, in every single corner of the body, every single cell membrane, every single mitochondrial membrane, remembering they're the engines of the cells, where all of this energy of food gets turned into energy. Every single corner of our bodies is now made up of inflammatory material. Is it any wonder that all disease is based on inflammation? Is it any wonder we've got out-of-control cancer, mental health, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, learning issues? You know, children's cancer rates are going up at around about 3% per annum over the last 40 years. Every year. An extra 3%, off a low base, but nonetheless it's going up. Cancer rates are going up. We can add in all sorts of other things, whether or not it's chemicals or, you know, again, things we talked about in the food cycle. But to me, the base first step is it's our food. And it's the one thing you can take control over today.
And when it comes to the seed oil piece, there is good and bad news there. The good news is over time, we can change up the food we're taking in, the fats and oils we're taking in, make better choices, and do sort of an oil change on our body over time. Bad news is it takes years. And that's not even, you just put up 4 fingers. That's not even the whole story. That's one half-life.
Yeah.
Talk more about that.
I think, well, it's really hard to drag out that data. I've just got to, it'll come to me back. There's a fellow in New York who's a professor of oils. I think he's retired now. He's written a book. Glenn, it'll come to me. Anyway, he wrote a piece about this, and then I wrote to him about it saying, what is the half-life of an omega-6 linoleic acid in the body? And he said, well, I'll read my book. So I read his book from cover to cover. Then I emailed him back saying, look, I've read your book from cover to cover. It's really interesting. We talk about all this inflammation or whatever, but you didn't answer my question of what is the half-life. And he says, very good question, Gary. We don't know. But it's probably in the vicinity of 4 years to get rid of those fats. It's got a slow turnover. So to get rid of fat, to reduce the amount of inflammation, the amount of oxidizable omega-6s in particular, is probably going to take at least 4 years. Now, anecdotally, if you listen to people, and again, listen to people who have got neurodegenerative problems, inflammation problems, autoimmune problems, they'll say that they do a low-carb ketogenic carnivore diet and they feel better. But if you really listen to them, and it's one of the few times I have listened to my sister and sisters-in-law, they say, one of my sister-in-laws, she was diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis. It was not quite right, but nonetheless, that was the diagnosis she was given. And she reluctantly agreed to try what I've been talking about and yapping about, because sisters never believe brothers. Have you got any sisters?
No, brother.
Yeah. Well, most siblings don't believe the other sibling, okay? Anyway, but she reluctantly did it. And then she came back to me and she said, 4 years down the track, she said, I've come off all my medication. Everything's better. Now, that's not just a one-off story. It's a multiple stories like that. I can't remember if I told you last time about she was our teenage daughter at that time. We got off the plane traveling, and she had a craving for McDonald's chips. And she's 16, tall, long, leggy, blonde. And she said, Dad, can I have some McDonald's chips? And she knew that I was very ate carbs, processed food, seed oils. And she looked me in the eye and she said, "Look, Dad, let me have them, please. I promise not to get pregnant for 4 years." Now, that is a perfect informed consent. She made a decision to poison her body, but she knew the repercussions of it were going to be there for 4 years, and she promised not to get pregnant. Now, you tell me any father who's not going to fork out $3 or whatever it is to have his 16-year-old daughter promise him that she's not going to get pregnant for 4 years. So she didn't, by the way, get pregnant. She's 29 now, but nonetheless. And that's an informed decision. And I quite like informed consent. Like if, as a surgeon, you give informed consent to patients before they have an operation. If you smoke nowadays, you've made a pretty well informed decision to be an idiot. The amount of information we have about tobacco causing harm and people still smoking, they know that it's bad for them, but they've done that. So it's an informed decision to smoke / to be an idiot. What I would like us to see, and maybe it will or won't happen in my lifetime, I'd like to see that if you decide to eat ultra-processed food, which is high in sugar and carbohydrates and seed oils, that you're making an informed decision to eat that, knowing that it's not good for you. That's a big step. Some years ago, people said, "What's your end game?" And our end game with diabetes has been achieved. And so, therefore, if you have type 2 diabetes, you should be informed that it is reversible by therapeutic carbohydrate reduction. That's the official term. And that you should be supported to do that. Now, it's not happening everywhere in the world, but here in Australia in the last couple of years, with an enormous amount of work, therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, low carb, is now in the National Diabetes Guidelines. It's been adopted as best practice guidelines by the Australian Diabetes Society, which is all endocrinologists, and by Diabetes Australia. So we have it now in the guidelines. So if you recommend this to people, you are no longer dangerous. This is based on good science. It's been adopted by the peak bodies to say this is it. So here in Australia, I've achieved an outcome that we want. For me, we've gotten to that point. There are other countries around the world, and I was speaking to a Nordic doctor, I won't mention which country because I don't want to, earlier this week, who's trying to do the same thing in this country, adopt a guideline which is now internationally referenced, but she's come up against all the same barriers that we have for the last 15 years. So low carb has got a clear scientific role in the management of diabetes. And if you've got diabetes and you want to eat sugar and ice cream, you're going to be making an informed decision to be an idiot. Can we now move that on to the rest of society to say, if you want to keep eating ultra-processed food, you're going to be making an informed decision for your poor health? And I think you've heard me say before, and I've said it, I'll keep saying it, if you eat by the food pyramid, you're going to die by the food pyramid, and along the way you're going to look like it. That's it in a nutshell. That food pyramid is not based on science, it's based on beliefs, it's based on food industry profitability and all those cereals and grains at the bottom. The My Plate that's out of the US guidelines doesn't even have meat on it anymore. It's just got protein, and it's still high, laden in carbohydrates when you break it all down. So if you eat by dietary guidelines, I'd like people to start saying, don't trust the government. How many examples have we had of that in the last, I'll just say a few years and leave it at that. Because the people who get involved in writing these guidelines, whether or not they're medical guidelines, the food guidelines, are pretty well supported or compromised by their industries. And so you don't have to scratch the surface very hard to find out that virtually everyone on these guideline committees has a tie to the food industry or the pharmaceutical industry. And so What do you think they come out with? They don't come out with something that says that's bad for their industry, do they? And we have continued to swallow this information in the belief that our government has our best interests. And no. And I haven't gone down any conspiracy theories there. It's not a conspiracy if it turns out to be a fact. It's just every day you read something which goes, I was talking about that 10 years ago. Now it's coming to fruition.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Now, my take on carbohydrates, particularly glucose and fructose, if they're so good for us, why does the body do absolutely everything in its capacity to get it out of the bloodstream?